Here we go. Okay, great to see you all again. Um,
You.
Welcome to the first of our Zoom sessions. We'll just open with a bit of scripture and a bit of prayer. I was teaching on the Foundations course, which is a sort of exploring vocation for lay people kind of course. You may know about 1 year of basic theology and exploring vocation on Sunday, and I asked people to choose a couple of psalms. One psalm that was a favorite that they really go to for spiritual nourishment, encouragement, and one psalm that was an unfavorite that they find difficult or awkward. And of course, somebody for their favorite chose Psalm 23 with all its comforting imagery, and somebody for their unfavorite chose Psalm 23. Not because of the content, but because it took her back to her grandmother's funeral, so it's the resonance it has with an event rather than the content of the psalm that was the thing for her, and that's always worth bearing in mind. I guess the same piece of scripture can evoke quite different responses, especially in terms of memories and emotional attachments. So let me read Psalm 23 for us tonight. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil. For you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, and my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long. So take a moment just to be still, to offer to God the things of this day so far, things we've been involved in, the people, especially anything that may be unresolved, and praying on our mind or whatever, and just commend all that to God in a moment of quiet. Lord, we commend you this evening as well. Thank you for this time, for being together, and we pray that you'll be with us in our listening, our speaking, our thinking, our learning together. And here's a collect which is assigned for yesterday, which is All Souls Day, when the churches traditionally remember those who have died. Eternal God, our Maker and Redeemer, grant us with all the faithful departed the sure benefits of your Son's saving passion and glorious resurrection, that in the last day, when you gather up all things in Christ, we may with them enjoy the fullness of your promises. Through Jesus Christ, your Son, our Lord, who is alive and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, I'll hand over really to Sarah and Mark, who between them are guiding us through this evening, and I'm just sort of hosting and doing the administration stuff. So whichever one of you wants to launch us, then you carry on from here.
Do you want me? Are you going first, Mark?
I don't mind. Do you want to share anything about the photo at this point? and
Um,
then, or I can share about personal experience and then invite other people too.
you can do it the way we said earlier, and then I'll come in with that later if you like.
Yeah, okay. So we thought this evening we would begin looking at personal experience um, and invite each of you to share maybe just for 3 or 4 minutes something of your experience of bereavement, loss, grief, just within the bounds of what you're comfortable sharing. And if it feels that it's too uncomfortable to share anything, that's absolutely fine. Um, we'll just let people sort of unmute and talk rather than sort of working through a list so that you don't feel there's any pressure in that way. I currently am doing a course called Clinical Pastoral Education, which is a training program for healthcare chaplains. Well, I guess anyone in pastoral ministry, but it's particularly used for healthcare chaplains in the States. And my supervisor always says it's good practice not to ask people to do something you're not prepared to do yourself. So I will begin by sharing some of my experiences, and then if time permits, Bill and Sarah might offer something, but we don't want to dominate and use up all the time we've got. So that's the reason that they're not particularly going to share. Um, so my experience relates back to when I was at theological college, um, and relates to a series of events that happened in sort of January of each of the years that I was at theological college. So in my um, first year at theological college, as we entered the second sort of term, one of my flatmates died very suddenly of an previously undiagnosed heart condition. Claire was a similar age to me. We had similar interests. I ran, she rowed. She actually collapsed while she was on a indoor rowing machine. Um, we both enjoyed music. She played the cello. I played the piano, violin, and enjoyed singing. And I can remember all sorts of sort of questions being left in why her, why not me, given our similarities. Um, in the preceding term, we'd looked at Job within the sort of theological studies, and I can remember at that point thinking how utterly inadequate was Job's response of the Lord gives, the Lord takes away, blessed be the name of the Lord. And yet I can remember walking across Prebends Bridge, one of the bridges in Durham where I was at college. And that was the one thing I could sort of hang on to, which was strange to sort of have, having had a sort of personal response and a theological response, and then both countering each other. And this will relate to some of the theory I'll look at a bit later. After Claire died, we had to spend the best part of a term because she was half French and actually lived in France before her belongings were collected by her parents. But they offered us, if there were particular belongings of hers that we might like. So I have a Le Creuset pot that's used for cooking casseroles and all sorts of things. It belongs to Claire. So whenever I use it, I'm always reminded of her as someone I knew, in a sense, for a brief time, but a significant time. And then in the next, in my second year, um, my granddad died at very much a similar time. That was a different form of grief. He had had multiple sclerosis, so in some ways I was expecting him to have died or knew he was dying over an extended period of time. Um, and then in my third year, a first year curate who had been a couple of years ahead of me died following an epileptic attack when he had been at home on his own, and was discovered a day or two later. I think from when it had actually happened, when he didn't turn up for the church service in the morning, and eventually the police were called to go into the house and obviously have it discovered that he had died. And again, I can remember thinking, oh my goodness, what our January is going to hold for me, because this was a sort of a third one, that collective aspect of it. But also when we drove to Simon's funeral, he came from the northeast, and so there had been a funeral at Newcastle Cathedral, and then a drive up into Northumberland where he was going to be buried. And as we drove up the A1, there was just this most incredible double rainbow of that ran across both sides of the carriageway. And as we were driving, it sort of traveled with us. And so they were in the midst of the sort of grief and the bereavement and that sense of, oh my goodness, what do I do with Januaries? Was also this promise, or at least in my interpretation of it, of this promise of both God being with there, but this was going to be the end of it, and I could survive further Januaries. So 3 different experiences of loss that sort of came in a particular period of time. And yeah, invite other people just to share something of their experiences in sort of 2-3 minutes.
Yeah, I'm quite happy to go next.
Thank you.
So it's really 2 ends of like a spectrum, really. The first one was my mother, who died when she was 49 and I was 12, and she had cancer, and she was ill for quite some time and passed away in the middle of the night. I think as a 12-year-old, it's hard to kind of quantify death, and certainly death of a parent. And I don't think I ever really I kind of dealt with it as a child deals with things. I think I sort of got on with life, and grew up, and it was just something now that's kind of in the dim, distant past. It was a long time ago. And at the other end was my father, who died in 2014. He too was ill for most of that year and passed away at the end of the year. I was very close to my dad. When my mother was alive, my dad was a pastor in a church, and I didn't see him very often. He was studying all the time, and he also had another job. And after my mum's death, then I sort of became close to my father, and we had a really good relationship. And when he passed away, he was in his 80s. It really hit me quite hard, and it took me probably a year of like grieving to get over his death. He was, very influential in my life. So at one end, as a child, I experienced death and funeral, and it kind of, I guess it went over my head a little bit. I think children are very good at adapting to circumstances. But as an adult in my 40s, when my father died, it absolutely knocked me sideways. So, but the thing is, they were both Christians, and I absolutely believe that they went to be and are with the Lord. So, yeah, that's my experience.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you. It's funny, Jonathan, that you mentioned around 12 years old, because that was the first death that I really recollect, and it was an aunt. And I remember for some time after that, I would be sneaking into my mum and dad's bedroom at strange hours of the night just to check they were still alive. And it was a very, very odd experience, and it persisted. So it was like the grieving went fairly quickly. And then there was this persistent period of being on just being a bit scared, I guess. When an aunt of mine died when I was in my 20s, that was a different experience because that was a shock. My previous aunt had been quite elderly. The aunt who died when I was in my 20s was in her 50s. And it was a shock. And I actually remember collapsing into a big heap and screaming the place down. And then when my mother died, that was another experience where she'd been poorly and bedridden and in hospital for some time. And it was very, very, it's always weird this, because I often say that the night on which she died was very, very almost special, in that it was Maundy Thursday over to Good Friday. And the nurse on the ward had changed that night. And the locum nurse that came in had actually once been one of my next door neighbors when she was a girl, when we were both in our teens. And it just seemed right. And my mother passed away, and I felt her go. The moment she went, I felt her go. So that was a different experience. That affected me greatly for some time afterwards. But it was like three very different reactions. I was estranged from my father when he passed away, and so that almost like it's only been, I mean, that was 20 odd years ago when my father passed. But I probably thought more about him in recent years than I did in the immediate aftermath of his dying, because I was not really informed about the funeral or anything. So it was a rather sort of left a bit open in many ways, that I didn't get proper closure on. And I guess I've kind of worked to that closure in my own head over that time. I have had some counseling, stuff like that, to deal with other things. But it's just struck me that, it is a case of there is no one size fits all. And even for an individual, there's this sheer width of experience that I've found, that I've had myself, that I never know quite what, when these things happen. I guess I never quite know what to expect. When my father-in-law died, that was another big impact event, but different to the others. So that's what I would say for myself, is that the difference in my reaction and the difference in my grief response has been quite significant.
Thanks, Joe.
Yeah. Mine's probably a double-edged one. 2005, when I lost my mum. I couldn't understand how anybody could put all their life into perspective and plan, what was going to happen afterwards. And it took me quite a while to come to terms with how she could do that. Mm-hmm. I quickly learned in 2014, when my wife was struck down with a brain tumor, and she lasted 12 months, in which time I gave up work and I nursed her for 12 months, and really then understood a little bit more about what my mum had done and why she'd done it, because I was having to look at all the things that my mum had done and everything within that time. And and it never really hit me. She died in the end of February 21st, 2015. And I think there was so much to do that it didn't actually hit me till about June. And then one night, for some reason, in the middle of June, I just broke down for some reason. I don't know why. And everything just came flooding out. Trying to get over that. And then what followed was I lost 3 of my best friends in the space of 5 months. Keith, he was just in his 80s, he'd cancer, and the other 2 died. One was my best mate, and he died. The other friend died, and my wife all died at the age of 66, which was quite a shock, when at the time I was a few years younger, and I had 6 years, just short of 6 years, to come to terms with that. At some point I'd got to get through 12 months of my life to get past that 66, because it was, it was so prominent in my life. And I think they really, really were some of the hardest times. The only saving grace I had out of them, that I was involved in some way with all of them and with their funerals. And since 2015, I know, Bill, you mentioned about All Souls Day we celebrated it on Sunday, and I've done that service with Eleanor now for 11 years. And it's the one service of the year that gives me a little bit of closure and a little bit of peace, that I just get that hour, just over an hour in church, to celebrate all the lives of my friends and also everybody else within the parish. So that's me.
Thank you, Keith.
Very good.
I totally get that with the All Souls service. And being able to gather everybody together and sort of like remember them and have closure on them at the, sort of like that same time. So part of my story is, I've been the one dying. My life expectancy was 30 years old. And I somehow got past that, and I've had new medication since then, and it's amazing. But I don't know. I can be quite morbid sometimes, because I'm just so used to death. I've had a lot of friends die, all younger than me, all younger than the age of 30. A lot of them in their 20s. My first friend died when I was 21, she was 20, so it was a really big shock. Caused a big separation from God at the time, because I just couldn't see how God could allow that to happen. And I've obviously mellowed over time, and I just sort of like, no, it's just part of life. Is you can't go on forever. Yeah. Obviously different experiences of many different funerals, some with more hymns, others with the ending song being Firestarter. I'm a twisted Firestarter. And the drugs don't work, by the verve. But yeah, funerals are sort of like I've got too much experience of. Really. Yeah, that's me.
Thank you, Joseph.
There we go. When I was a child, I lived in Canada, and the first meeting, anything to do with death, was my dad took me to the church, or a house or something, and my grandfather was dead and in an open coffin. And I'd never seen anybody dead. I wasn't frightened by him. The only thing I realized was that he was like my dad. And I found it quite fascinating. The room was full of people, and it didn't worry me at all. I didn't go to the funeral or anything, but I still can only remember my granddad's face. I can't, I never saw him alive. I only saw him dead. And then when we came to England, we went to my grandparents, and about 6 months after we moved, we went back to stay, my mum and my two brothers and myself, for the weekend, because my grandma had been poorly, and I'd gone to bed, and we'd all were in bed, the kids, and my mum was downstairs, and my granddad shouted my mum, and she came upstairs, and they were in the bedroom where grandma was, and I could tell by the voices that something was serious. And we lived in a village they lived in a village with no phone or anything. And so I went in and said, can I help? And they said, can you go to the farm down the road and get the doctor to come, which I did. And he came, and she did die. And I didn't cry, it didn't upset me, but I seemed to be fascinated in how, the adults reacted. It seemed as if that's what I seemed to focus on, that like there was life after death, life went on, and that's what was important. And then when I was 19, a bit like Jonathan, my dad died suddenly. I was at college, my first year at college, and I decided to go home that weekend with my friend to Sheffield. And that night he died. We woke up in the morning and he was dead. Now, that was a totally different experience, because that absolutely wrecked me. For over a year, like I just lost my confidence. I found it difficult to talk to people and to get on with college life. But I did. I persevered and got through it. And then, I don't know, that seemed to have the most strongest effect of somebody dying in my life. I think it was because I'd never experienced anybody. And I went to his funeral, obviously, and it was a cremation. And they put him in the coffin behind the curtain, and then they opened the curtain and he wasn't there. And that scared me, absolutely freaked me, because I didn't know what had happened. Because often you go and they either leave the coffin there, or the curtains don't open again, but as a child, I found that absolutely very, very hard. And I always vowed then that with my own children, when I felt they were ready, I would take them to funerals with me, so they understood the service, they understood the effect on people, and how it, life went on, and for me, God was there and supported me. I mean, I've been to funerals where there was it wasn't a Christian funeral, and I just prayed all through the service, because I couldn't bear them not to have God in their lives. But then because my mum had been ill, and we sort of helped her all the way through, and she died. She managed to get us all together and talk to each one in turn. And when she died, we could cope with it better because we'd spent that time with her. So it's just, they were all just so different, how they affected my life. And long term, they affected my life, particularly my dad seemed to have a terrible effect. Yeah.
Thank you, Barbara.
I've lost both my parents, but with a gap of many years between. My dad had emphysema as he retired as a teacher, and he died at 66. We thought that we knew he was really poorly, and we expected him to have another couple of years. And then the night before, my mum and him were going away to celebrate their 40th wedding anniversary. They were going to travel abroad. He just collapsed and died instantly. So that was a massive, massive shock. My children were tiny. and it was just, a massive shock. But he had a funeral in the Goole Parish Church, and he was a very, very popular teacher, and he'd also been involved in lots of charity things as well. And the church was absolutely bursting with people. My elder sister gave a tribute to him, and my younger sister and I didn't sort of join in that, but it rocked me for a long time. And then moving on to 2020, in the middle of COVID, my mum, who was by then 89, she got various ailments, and basically her organs started packing in one weekend. And it was all very weird because it was the middle of COVID, so she was whisked off to hospital, and we were allowed actually to go with her, even though a lot of hospitals weren't allowing that. And she seemed okay. They got her stabilised. And the last thing my sisters and I remember sort of her saying was, we left her trying to eat a sandwich, but not really succeeding. And she said, "Oh, can you bring me some money tomorrow to buy a paper when they come round with them?" So we went off home thinking, great, she's comfortable now. And then we got a call about midnight sort of saying, we think you ought to come. She's taken a drastic turn for the worst. And so all three sisters rushed off to Scunthorpe. And again, the hospital were brilliant and allowed us to be with her as she passed away. We sat with her for several hours until she just sort of ebbed out. But it was really peaceful and very moving. But because of it being COVID, we couldn't have a proper funeral. I think we had about 15 or so people in the church, and then other people stood outside. And my sisters and I this time all joined together and did a tribute. And then we went off to the crematorium, and we couldn't sit together. All the chairs sort of dotted about, and we just had to, the vicar, Hannah, sort of said, well, turn round and sort of, wave to each other. And it was just all very surreal. Couldn't have a proper sort of gathering afterwards. A very small group of the family just had lunch, which was nice. But it was all very weird with it all being COVID. And I would say I'm still grieving her loss now, really. But I suppose it's not that long ago. But she only lived around the corner. And during her latter years, I did feel very close to her. So, and she'd done an awful lot helping to bring up look after my kids whilst we were at work and things. So she played a large part, well, as my dad did too. They both played a large part in my life and were very supportive all through my life. So that's my experience.
Thank you.
Mine's to do with guilt. I had two parents who lived down in Bedford, and I'm in Sheffield. And the day my dad died, he actually sat up in bed next to my mother and died from a heart attack. My mother, who had been suffering and suffered from multiple sclerosis for 40 odd years, couldn't move. And so she was sat or laid next to my dad for over an hour, waiting for the carers to come in and actually find my dad, which they did. And at the time, there wasn't the time there for me to grieve because I had to then look after my mum. And so it just felt as if I was spending the time looking after her, making sure she was comfortable, finding her somewhere to actually go to live after my dad's death. And the support that I had from the village was quite immense, really, because they filled the church and helped to help my mum find a rest home in the village to go and stay in. And then, of course, dealing with Dad's affairs, it took time out, and I just didn't have or feel I had the time at that time to grieve properly. Mum died 3 years later, and again, I wasn't around because on the Saturday before she died, I'd been in touch with her in the nursing home and said, look, I'm due to go away on holiday for a few days. And they said, that's okay. She looks as if she's okay, and she's quite happy. You go on holiday. So off we went to the North York Moors. And when she died on the Wednesday, they had no telephone connection with me at all because they couldn't actually get the signal. And I didn't find out until the following day that she died. And then it was arranging again the funeral, and it was at that point that the grief for both parents actually struck. Having the things to sort out for both parents was a very, very grief-stricken thing, I found. But I had the comfort in knowing that Mum and Dad had gone to the Lord and were being cared there for. And so in that was part of my story. The other part being that I worked for a large company for 14 years. And during that time, one day, we were waiting for one of our team leaders to come and take a conference at 9 o'clock in the morning. He didn't turn up, and we waited and waited. And at 10 o'clock, one of the other team managers went to his house and found him dead in bed. He died from a sudden heart attack, very young, of 30. And it was odd because people then turned to myself as a Christian and asked me why that had been and what had happened. And actually, I found myself in the grief. I was actually also comforting others. And that was a strange feeling. That's my story.
Thanks, Ian.
Yeah. I think the first encounter of death I remember was somebody at school. It wasn't a particularly friend of mine, but he was a lad in our form. And I remember I wrote a letter on behalf of our form. He was in hospital. We didn't know at the time, but he got a form of cancer. And I remember we'd had the school holidays, and we came back, and it was an assembly, and our headmaster stood up, and he announced that Robert had passed away. And it was that kind of a shock, because teenagers, you don't expect a teenage person to pass away, do you? It was a shock. And for a long time, every time the headmaster stood up rather serious, I thought, hey, what's going to happen? Who else has died? But as years gone by, of course, you encounter death in different forms. My dad passed away in 2011. I'd been ill for a long time, so it wasn't a shock. But I remember my mum asked if I would do the funeral, and I said no, because you've got to think when you lead a funeral, you've got to be together. And I thought I wouldn't be together. I ended up reading a poem in the funeral, which he'd written, and that took all I could do. That was a struggle. And then my mum passed away in 2014. And while we were preparing for her funeral, I learned that my nephew had passed away as well. So I always think that was kind of a grief interrupted. So we were grieving for my mum, and then we started grieving for my nephew. So that was quite complex. So yeah, it's a strange thing, is grief. Yeah.
Thanks.
My experience of my parents dying was my father died first, and we were slightly expecting it. He was in hospital, and I suppose I just felt it was very peaceful, and he went to the place he'd always talked about. So I was going to say happy, but we were sort of. And then about a year later, it was a surprise. I didn't expect my mum to die. She'd been talking on the phone to my sister, and actually we didn't find out that she died until the day after. And somebody phoned up and said, "Oh, can we let the cat out of your mum's house?" And I said, "Cat? My mum doesn't have a cat." And she said, "Well, she said, you know your mum's died." And I said, "Well, no." And so that was quite a shock and surprise. And so I was here alone, and I really appreciate that. I'm glad a policeman wasn't standing at the door saying, "Sorry, we couldn't get hold of you. We've had to, your mum died in hospital." And so I could grieve. That was really nice for me. I phoned up my sister, and I phoned up one of my brothers, and so we went the next day, and it was. I think our togetherness helped us. I know it seems terrible to say it, but we had some fun, really. Just talking and about things that my mum had left, and just finding things. We emptied the freezer. My sister cooked a dinner with all the food, and then as a whole family, there were lots of us children, but it was a good funeral. But there was a sad funeral that sticks with us. And my husband's sister had ME, and she had wanted to go to Switzerland. So my husband knew this, but we sort of hoped she wouldn't or do anything like that. And I suppose I feel bad, really, because you just think she was down in Cornwall and we're up in Sheffield, so it was quite hard to have communication. And one day we found out that her husband phoned and said that she'd taken some medicine that she'd got off the internet, and she'd taken her own life. And it still feels she took her own life. And I worry about the bill going through Parliament. It just lives with you that and I feel sad for her two sons, really. I'm sure they still feel sad. And my husband, really, it was his only sister, and I don't know whether we still sort of, is a hole there, and there's a sadness. But I don't know. She just felt that life wasn't worth living, and it was all too hard for her with her ME. And so there's two different experiences. She didn't really have a Christian faith. She had some Christian influence or knowledge, but it obviously it hadn't helped her however much we tried. That's my story.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
I think for me, I'm very blessed. I still have all of my parents, but I was very involved in my mother-in-law's funeral, and I should never have met my mother-in-law. She was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer about a year before I met my husband, and she made my wedding dress. She met our son. So it was 10 years after I'd first met her. So I did have a really good relationship with her. But the last 2 years of her life, she'd had a severe heart attack that she never recovered from. So she had quite bad dementia, was bedbound. And so there was always an element of kind of that relief and that release. But then there was also the guilt around not having been there enough, and somehow that there was something that we'd missed, we should have done more. And I know my husband has a lot, like somebody else, I think it was Ian maybe mentioned a lot of guilt around not being there. And I know my husband is upset that he wasn't there and blames his dad still for that. My first experience was my granddad died when I was similar story to Sarah told last time. My granddad died when I was about 6, and we weren't allowed at the funeral. The children under a certain age weren't allowed. And it was just really confusing what had happened, and didn't really know. But then when my grandmas both passed away, I was a lot older. I already had family and stuff by then. So that was a completely different experience because they were both in their 90s and I was an adult. So that was a lot more, and they were both big church funerals, with people who I'd never met because the church congregations turned out. And I think that kind of makes it a different experience as well. Whereas my mother-in-law, she'd come to church with me on Christmas Eve. And I know she had some faith, but she didn't have a lot. And my husband doesn't have any faith. So it was probably the most difficult part of it for me was, I think, that there wasn't really anything in the service from a faith point of view, which was hard to know that there could have been, I suppose. Maybe I didn't, and also I suppose it's maybe I didn't do enough to encourage her to come with me more than just on Christmas Day, Christmas Eve.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you, everyone. I was reminded of one of the funeral sentences from the Book of Common Prayer. In the midst of life, we are in death. Through your sharing and that sense of death happening at any time. We've listened to stories of people who've died in their 80s, 90s, those who've died in their teenage years, and I guess all aspects in between. Thank you for the vulnerability of sharing part of your stories with us. Sarah, did you want to say some stuff at this point, and then we'll perhaps move to a break?
Yeah, is that what you... Okay, so I'll just share one thing with you. What I think, just listening to everyone speaking, it made me think about how, as ministers, you will hear so many stories, many different TRs, and some that we've never experienced before. But what I was holding on to with all that was hope. Now, when and I've gone through different experiences of death, just like some of you have. I mean, they're all different, aren't they? And none of our experiences from different people who we've loved that have died have been the same. But one thing I wanted to show you, which might not look much to you at all, but Mark, would you mind just sharing the photo with me, with everyone? Sorry. On the night that my father-in-law died, Leon and I were travelling home, and it was interesting that you talked about the rainbows, Mark. So, are you able to put that on full screen, Mark? I'll keep talking while you do that. It's not a great picture, so I'm sorry about that. But
Is that showing for people now?
it's showing for me, so I'm assuming it's showing for other people as well.
Yep, yeah, I can see that.
Yeah.
So on the night that my father-in-law died, which I shared with you at our last at our first session, and we were driving home, and what you can see there is a ray of light that we spotted while we were driving. So I asked my husband to pull over so that we could have another look at it. And it was the most beautiful thing we'd ever seen. And for us, in all of the grief and the awful day of different feelings that we'd gone through, that image that you can see there, that light in the sky, took our breath away and really helped with how we were dealing with the grief and the guilt and the upset and the anger and every feeling you could possibly imagine. And it felt like we were getting a message of a message from God. And it was at the point when, I mean, we were Christians at that point in our lives. And we were even looking, when I look at that image, I can see things in it. And when I look at it now, and you can take it off, Mark, actually, if you'd like. When I'm looking at that picture, for all of you looking at it, I appreciate completely that it just looks rather usual and not unusual at all, and is fairly meaningless, really. And it was probably some laser from the ground just beaming up in the night sky, but it wasn't to us. It was a sign from God saying it's okay. And I wanted to, before we go for a break, just leave that there. That in because we'll talk about that more when we come back. Actually, about how we process grief in our own ways, how the people that we will be ministering to look for signs and hope, how they deal with despair and guilt and all of those things. I mean, we won't be able to go through all of those things, but I just wanted to share that, because for me, that was, when I share that with somebody else, I am completely aware that it's a really rubbish photo and you won't see in it what I saw. But for me, it meant everything. And it did my husband as well. So I think it's about leaving that image of what we don't see for other people is huge. And that's the sort of thing that we take on in this ministry, is trying to understand what we can't feel and see. But we can work from our own experiences, and we will work from our own experience, because human nature. So I don't know, is it break time now? What time did we say? Because it's just gone 8 o'clock. Do you want to break up, Mark and Bill, and come back? If we
Yeah, should we come back have a sort of roughly 5 minutes break and restart at 8:15? Does that work, Bill?
That's fine. Yeah, I think it's half time, so it's a good time to have a break. So yes, if we do about 5 minutes or so, time to have a stretch. People okay with that? Is that all right? Yeah. And then we'll come back and go on from there. Yeah.
Mark, Bill, are you okay if we just stay on for a minute?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Okay, thanks everyone. We'll see you soon.
Right.
So we started the session with experience, and we're going to have a little look at some of the sort of theory around grief, loss, bereavement, and then we'll sort of open into sort of wider discussion and also to think a bit more about some of the practical aspects that might be there. So these are some basic definitions. So loss, understood as an instance of losing someone or something. In talking about grief, bereavement, tonight we've largely talked about the death of someone, but loss can obviously be wider than that. A loss of independence, a loss of employment, loss of a particular role, and the way that that ties in to grief and bereavement. Then grief is understood as the normal process of reacting to the loss of something or someone important. It's a multi-layered reaction in that it has emotional, physical, cognitive, behavioral, social, philosophical dimensions. And grieving is the outward expression of a loss. And grief theory, as we'll come to, is normally traced back to Freud and his essay Mourning and Melancholia, which views grief as a necessary, albeit painful process, which is called grief work. Then we come to mourning, which is the natural process of going through and accepting a loss. Mourning will often be shaped by or include religious and cultural traditions. Mourning may both be sort of understood as an expression of grief, as well as sometimes describing a formal or a set period of grieving that follows a loss. And that also therefore often ties back into the religious or cultural traditions and expectations. And then bereavement being understood as the period after a loss during which grief is experienced and mourning occurs. The time spent in bereavement depends on how attached a person was to someone who was the person or the object or the, I guess, identity that was lost, and how much time might have been spent anticipating the loss. It's worth starting with this fact that, as you'll see as we go through, most understandings of grief implicitly use a medical framework. Construed in this way, grief is seen as analogous to an illness. A bereaved person has been struck down with something, but given time, the expectation is that they will recover and return to how they were before. This, though, ignores some significant facts. This is a quote from Douglas Davis, who was an anthropologist and theologian at Durham. He states that the sort of medical model of grief ignores deep facts of existence, whether existential experiences lying at the heart of life or religious experiences at the center of faith. Some experiences influence human life so much that people are never the same again. They simply become different people through what has happened to them. To speak of recovery is to talk about a kind of backward change, an undoing of what has been done, an unliving of part of life. That's perhaps a sort of academic way of understanding it. These are words from Richard Olson, who was the founder of the National Stillbirth Society in America, who writes, "I don't want to be well adjusted. I don't want to be accepting. I don't want to be healed, when healing is to be freed of feeling." Perhaps a more graphic way of understanding it. But I think various of you in sharing your experiences talked about that ongoing aspect and how it had changed and shaped you. So grief, generally normal grief, or sometimes termed uncomplicated grief, is viewed as lasting between 6 months to 2 years, with an expectation that the intensity of the emotions and feelings will lessen over time. various of you, again, in what you shared, spoke about things lasting well over a year in that way. Another commonly described type of grief is what is often termed anticipatory grief. The clue is in the title. It's the experience of the anticipation of a loss. Often that might be when someone has a terminal illness and death is expected and takes time to come, but we know it's coming. I guess, again, we might think particularly about people with Alzheimer's and dementia, where there's a sense of having lost the person already in some ways. But there also might be anticipatory grief more widely beyond death. Again, thinking about perhaps someone coming up to retirement or leaving a job and how that affects and shapes someone. Complicated grief, sometimes called traumatic, prolonged, or chronic grief, is generally grief that continues beyond that 6 months to 2 years. So it becomes severe in length and is significantly impacting someone's ability to function, to hold down their job or to work. It may often sort of be linked with depression or other mental health aspects. And it's generally thought that that would be experienced by 10 to 20% of people who are bereaved in a significant way. Another type of grief often described is disenfranchised or ambiguous grief, which happens when someone feels that society or people close to them have denied their right or their need to grieve. Often with disenfranchised grief, it's a loss that in some ways can't be acknowledged publicly or mourned publicly or isn't socially supported. That can sometimes happen if a loss or a death was caused by something that society frowns on, like drug or alcohol misuse. There may also be aspects of, if we think again about suicide or assisted suicide, if people feel that they can't talk about that or acknowledge that in some way. Of course, there's also when there might have been affairs or other secret relationships that make it difficult for someone to grieve or have their grief acknowledged, and so it's held and not expressed in some ways. Absent grief, again, as it sounds, may be due to lots of anticipatory grief or even a relief at a death. And then collective grief is the grief experienced by communities or societies. It's most often talked about in relation to the death of famous people, but it might happen when a particular community has suffered and some form of sort of collective loss. I guess the Stockport stabbings would be one example of that from a few years ago. I think I was interested when I was looking at this. It's often thought, I think sometimes it feels like people talk about the death of Princess Diana as this sort of moment where lots of people grieved and we suddenly became a society that lost the sort of stiff upper lip. But actually, when you look back, there have always been those sort of collective moments. So if you search up the reports of the funeral of Admiral Lord Nelson in 1805, you'll find journalists describing reports of immense crowds gathering, lining the streets, and there being tears gushing from every eye. So it's not a sort of new thing in that way. As I said, since Freud, grieving and mourning have generally been conceived as the process whereby the bereaved person adjusts to the reality of their loss. And I'm sort of going to whiz through some key theories and thinkers just to give some frameworks for thinking about this. So the first person to mention is John Bowlby. He was a British psychologist and psychiatrist who was a pioneer in thinking about attachment theory in children. He was particularly interested in troubled youth and determining what family circumstances contributed to healthy versus unhealthy development in children. He later, as you'll see, there's a sort of pattern here of people thinking about things in one context and then the thinking being taken into bereavement. So his theories were then applied to grief and bereavement, particularly working with his colleague Colin Murray Parkes. They talked about a natural adaptive grief response for when an attachment is broken, and then developed that into 4 phases of grief. The first, shock and numbness; second, a yearning and a searching; third, despair and disorganization; and 4, recovery, reorganization and recovery. From 4 phases, we move to 5 stages. And if you've done anything around grief theory, or come across any theories, it's probably Kubler-Ross's 5 stages that you'd have come across. It's a model that was based on her experience of and interviews with terminally ill patients. As it was first published and designed, the model was applied to those facing the reality of their own death, rather than for those responding and reacting to the death of someone else. But practitioners found that the constructs worked, or seemed to also fit within their analysis and treatment of individuals grieving post-death. You don't have to search far to find an awful lot of criticisms of the model, though it's probably, as I said, I suspect the one that most people know of, and the various aspects there. I think today practitioners today would be say that there is no sense that you move through these 5 stages in any particular order, and you can go back and forth between them. But I think it still can be helpful for understanding some of the sense of what either you bereaving or someone you're supporting in bereavement might be going through, and that aspect of normalizing the fact that someone might be in denial or might be angry, and those different aspects there. So the next stop on our whistle stop tour is Werden, and his theory marks a move from the concept of sort of stages or phases into talk of tasks. Although there is a certain logical progression to them, echoing the criticisms that there were of Kubler-Ross's model, Werden is clear that his tasks are done in no particular order, and someone grieving may need to revisit certain tasks over time. Again, I forget which person it was, but someone talked about sort of finding that they were only able to process part of the grief later on, and other people have sort of only really suddenly realizing the reality of a loss again later on when another death occurred. So they sort of move back and forward between it. I find Werden quite helpful in my work in the hospital. I think not least because of the notion of tasks being a reminder that grief can be hard work. It can be sort of tiring at best and utterly exhausting at worst, and there are sort of things to have to do with it. Again, I think also it's helpful in normalizing things, for saying that it's completely normal for people to wake up 2 or 3 days after a loss and think, did it really happen? And to have to work to accept the reality of it again. You'll notice that I've included some words in strikeout in that 4th task. So when Werden first published his work, his 4th task was those words in strikeout. So his 4th task was to emotionally relocate the deceased and move on with life. His work has been published a number of different times, and in the latest edition, which I think is the 5th edition, his 4th task has changed. It changes through the different editions. And his 4th task becomes to find an enduring connection with the deceased in the midst of embarking on a new life. That's an important change, and it marks him taking account of the work of these people, particularly Silverman and Klass, and their work on continuing bonds. Largely based on their studies of other cultures, I think particularly in Japan, but also the ways that children respond to loss. And quite a few of you talked about your experiences as a child, and how that differed from the adults around you that you could see. But also in their work with widow and widowers and how they were responding to the death of a spouse and continuing life afterwards. Their model argues that, well, that they questioned I guess, the dominant theme in models, which was this expectation that you finished a grieving process by having a detachment from the person who died. They argued that that denied the reality of how many people grieve. And instead, they suggest this new paradigm of continuing bonds, where healthy grief does not resolve by detachment from the deceased, but rather in creating a new relationship with them. In this model, when a loved person dies, the person who's grieving slowly finds way to adjust to and to refine and redefine their relationship with that person, allowing that continuing bond that will endure, albeit in different ways and in varying degrees to their life. And again, various of you spoke about continuing to have those memories and continuing to be affected by the loss in different ways. I guess just with like all theories, it's important not to force everyone to follow any particular aspect of a theory. So there will be some people who would not find comfort in a continuing bond for a variety of very good reasons. I've mentioned criticisms of the sort of linear nature of models, and this was probably the first model, Strobe and Schutt, their dual process model, that tried to express something of the complexity of grief. The paper that they present their model in is very critical of those linear models. But a key criticism, alongside the fact of this sort of expectation of moving in this neat process, is how that those models deal with issues of avoidance, denial, and sort of repression of grief. As I noted with Worden and his task, grief can be emotionally, physically exhausting. And those earlier models see such work as being crucial to healthy grieving. In contrast, the dual process model argues that to avoid or deny or suppress certain aspects of grief is not only normal, but is a healthy and important part of grieving. So they describe two areas or two aspects of loss. So they have loss-orientated stresses, which are defined as the stresses that come from focusing on and processing the loss of a person who has died. And then restoration-orientated stresses, which relate to rebuilding life and working out how you're going to be without the person. So for a lot of people, some of the stresses are working out, well, the person who died used to always do the finances. How am I going to cope with that? What's key in their process is that a person oscillates between the two. They also say that it's important to take a break, and you can move between the different ones when it's getting stressful, recognizing that both can be stressful. This is their attempt to try and put it into a diagrammatic form. So you can see that sometimes the arrows, the lines sort of stop in the middle, and that's representing that sense of it's all right at times just to sort of not do anything and just sort of veg out or whatever it is, rather than feeling you've got to work all the way through. And then the last stop on this tour is Darian's model of adaptive grieving dynamics, which seems to get shortened to MAGD or MAGD. This is the most recent model, having been published just a little over 10 years ago. And in presenting the model, Darian's aim was to create a model that embraced something of the diversity of grieving and the myriad types of loss that people face in ways that previous models have yet to capture. And we heard again in your sharing just that depth of difference, even is individuals finding that they grieve differently to different losses. The model is based on an extensive review of the grief and bereavement literature, and the view that people naturally adapt to loss by engaging in these four dynamic pillars, and the idea that they need to be engaged in a sort of balanced way. What's notable is that the pillars are based on what is termed in the paper the adaptive purpose of the behavior, i.e. they try to describe why someone is doing something rather than just describing a particular emotion or behavior, which the earlier models had done, whether it's you're in denial or you're angry or whatever it was. So pillar one is adaptive lamenting, and encapsulates the distressful, the disheartening, the painful responses of grief. It acknowledges the raw emotions that arise from loss and that need to express them. Pillar two, heartening, is a contrast to lamenting and recognizes that actually aspects of grief and loss can be gratifying, uplifting, even pleasurable amidst the other painful feelings. And again, various of you, I think, Elizabeth, I think you mentioned the word fun, and other people talked about peaceful and uplifting processes. I guess for me, again, that sense of that rainbow, and for Sarah, that light was something would have been a heartening aspect. The third pillar, adaptive integrating, focuses on assimilating those internal and external changes brought about by the loss, finding what life is going to look like as the person goes forward, what a new identity might be. Recognizing the sort of integrated aspect of this, obviously, lamenting and heartening responses are going to help a person in integrating. And then pillar four, adaptive tempering, echoes some of the Strobe and Schutt critique of previous models, and that relates to just taking time and not feeling that you have to sort of work through all of this and be overwhelmed by doing the grief work. So it emphasizes the importance of self-care, setting boundaries to prevent exhaustion and just burning out through the sort of grief process. I think that this model acknowledges the complexity of grief well, and I think it's helpful in the way that the pillars can be experienced simultaneously, so we can have that aspect of both grief being at times bringing feelings of relief, but then also the more negative feelings, whether that's guilt or pain for the loss in different ways. The idea of the model is that the pillars work as pairs. So you have the lamenting and the heartening and the tempering and the integrating, with the idea that Darian suggests that you should try to map your responses and identify where there might be imbalances. So if you're doing a lot of tempering, then maybe you need to think about doing a bit more integrating. Again, I think the model is helpful because it recognizes the complexity, and because the pillars describe not just emotions, but relate to experience, they can be understood from a range of perspectives. So you can draw on the sort of physical side of grief, but also the emotion, the psychological, and the spiritual side to it. So one person lamenting, that might take the form of painful emotions, where for another it might be more feeling helpless, or for another it might actually be a physical pain. One griever's heartening might happen in storytelling, remembering the person, and perhaps through collective acts of public worship, or public remembrance. For someone else, it might actually come through moments of silence, solitude, being out in nature. So in summary, grief theories can be helpful. I think each can provide some perspectives and understanding on what might be happening, but important to remember that no theory is going to provide everything. I liked the idea that I read where someone said that grief is less a one-way tunnel, it's more of a labyrinth. And as we've seen, we are all unique individuals. It's inconceivable that anyone could know exactly what someone else is going through. And again, I liked this as a statement that I read somewhere, that grief is not something we need to heal from, rather grief is the healing.
Mm.
There were then, and Bill will send these around, a number of different sort of images that try to, again, sort of capture something of that labyrinth nature of grief. I rather liked this one, the sense that it might be describing a sort of straight journey, but the experience is it's all over the place.
Yeah.
And again, a couple of others that pick up on those aspects. And should you wish to do further reading, there is a range of possible books. Some are theory, some are sort of actual fiction, but explore things around death, and then sort of some are autobiographies where people are talking about different experiences of bereavement and loss. So I realise that's been a lot of information to assimilate in a short space of time, but yeah, the slides will get sent around. Happy to answer questions on. Sarah, you might want to sort of ground us again.
I was thinking about when in funeral ministry, as you were going through some of those things, I might not have experienced some of those things that you've just brought out in that theory, but I've certainly witnessed it in other people. One of the things that we haven't really touched on tonight is pre-death grieving, really. And I was thinking, there have been many times in this ministry, for my ministry, where I've visited people who are expected to die at any moment. We just don't know. And there was one particular time when I went to visit a lady who was dying, and they wanted me to take communion to her. And the family almost want me to be able to tell them when it will happen. There is an expectation from, I don't know what people expect of us, really, when we go in. Some hope, obviously some comfort. And this lady was pretty much unconscious. I couldn't have given her communion. But what I did instead was offered communion to the family that were there. And the response of some of the family, well, we've not taken it before. We don't know what to do. But the whole thing ended up being really quite beautiful and a really special moment. But then unexpectedly, I got a phone call a couple of days later to say that the lady had fully recovered and was now sat up in bed and wanted communion, and lived for another 6 months. But it was the actual, which is was. I saw the family in deep grief, really expecting this woman that they loved so much to take a last breath. And she looked like I don't know what she looks like. I wouldn't pretend to have any medical experience at all, but I mean, she didn't look good. And then something happened where she just miraculously sat up and wanted some food, and so I went back to give her communion. We had a bit of a laugh about it, really, and she says, well, I wasn't ready, I was just teasing them. And actually, when she did die, it was almost like that experience had helped them a little bit for when it came to when it really did happen. I mean, I remember them, one of the daughters ringing me and just saying, we're not sure if she's just kidding us again, but we think she's going to go this time. And we took, and actually we did have quite a bit of fun around that, and smiles, and she'd been a little monkey all her life, so there was no reason why she wouldn't be at this point as well. And I remember sharing such beauty with them when actually they were in the midst of grief, and looking at some of those theories that Mark shared. You know, I mean, my experience is probably more the crazy patterns all over. I'm not really sure I could measure it up into a lovely, neat line with grief. Another experience for me was I've had over the last couple of years, 3 years, 2 very close uncles of mine dying. And because I'm a priest, or because I do funeral ministry, it was quite expected by the family that I would pick those up and take the funerals. And in all of that time, I'm trying to process grief myself and the loss of my beautiful uncles, who both died quite suddenly. And then seeing particularly the grief that my auntie was already going through before my uncle died, because she was desperate for him not to let go. She was very angry with God, even though she didn't know where she was with God. Very angry that he would take her husband, and the emotions were so up and down. She did come and stay with us for a little while because she was so unstable after he died. But I found I did find the theories really helpful, Mark, because I would have not believed those when I saw, you know, when you show them written down, it's hard to understand that process, just seeing it in black and white. But I've been so close next to my auntie, whilst being able to be kind of on the outside a little bit, whilst understanding faith, and being knocked by faith and grief and everything else around me, that those stages really did happen. And it helped me to then be able to pastorally help other people, not because there is this simple graph, because there isn't, because it's great, you know, we're all, like I said, mine will be all over the place, but actually there is this pattern. And now my auntie, who I honestly was worried about whether she would take her own life, she was in such deep grief, that I now see, although her grief, she's still desperately sad, and she will forever miss him. Life has started to just take a different turn, a little bit of a different step. She and watching her as closely as I have, and been trying to help her pastorally as much as I have, and also taking my uncle's funeral, has been really helpful for me, for processing my grief, but also for helping understand future, you know, going into people's homes, and you know, you will go into some homes as people are dying, and everybody will be, you know, the people will be very quiet. You'll go into others where it's wailing of crying, and in all of that we've got to try and stay focused and strong without becoming, I suppose it's at first I thought that I'd never be able to cope with other people's grief. I thought I would continuously cry, but actually, there was one of those books there that Mark pointed out that I'd read. The Good Grief is a really good one as well, because how do we control our emotions when we've gone through we've all shared such stories tonight, that each and every one of you have gone through immense grief in your life, and actually the ministry that you're thinking about is going into other people's lives with all that you carry and all that they're going through, which will be really helpful for you, even if it doesn't feel like it sometimes. One of the things that I've found more helpful is just sat sometimes with people who are grieving and not really saying anything at all, just allowing some space. In fact, to be honest, what I often find when I am with people that are in the very first stages of grief is that they're fed up with talking. They just want some space. They don't necessarily want to be on their own, but I think that's important too, for people to be on their own so that they can grieve in whatever way they want to, without feeling they've got to behave in a different way in front of somebody else. So I just wanted to share that with you. I'm a very feeling person, so I work on feeling, and then in all of that, trying to put practicalities into this ministry as to how, if I've got 4 or 5 funerals lined up, and some of them are really tough, all of them are sad, some of them are tougher than others depending on the circumstances, is how do we keep us, even though, and we've gone through some of this ourselves in our own personal lives, is how do we then keep our own faith, sanity, keep grounded and stay professional. I don't know all the answers, by the way. Mark knows all the answers, so he'll give you all those. But just listening to you all tonight, there's no one story the same, is there? And no one grief process the same. And but what is really beautiful in this ministry is going with people. So there's the before somebody dies, if they're ill, and then going through the process of the death and the funeral, and then afterwards, and how we carry them through the grieving process, through months, years to come, and how important that is. And that's people with no faith, with or knowing, who have a real relationship with Jesus. So it's a beautiful ministry, but it's also it can be very hard on you. So it's how you are able to manage other people's grief without taking that on, which isn't always easy. As I say, I don't know if we'll come to a part. There may be that we have other resources. Mark, you might be able to help me with this, for people who who are involved in funeral ministry themselves to read, that will help them through that process. I have plenty of books that I offer to people that are grieving, and I know kind of what they are, but it's what sort of books could you recommend? Bill, you might be able to help to keep us on, apart from the Bible, of course, but what practical things can we use to help us cope with the grief and the sadness that we're often around in this ministry?
I'm just looking at the sort of program for the whole year. The final session in June, we've included there something about taking care of yourself and recognizing your vulnerabilities. So that, I think, will come up there. But yeah, it's good to ask it anytime, really. I don't know if Mark's got any tips or resources on how people handle that.
I think it's as much as anything, knowing yourself and knowing what your capacity for things are and when you might need to take a break, and recognizing what your own stresses are in that way, and yes, how you self-care. So whether that's after, if you've taken a complicated funeral, do you need to block time out so that you can go off and sit somewhere in quiet, or do you need to go to the gym and throw weights around, or whatever it is that's going to work for you? So I think that aspect of knowing yourself and knowing your own sort of spirituality and the way that you do things. So that's probably the sort of key. And like bereavement itself, that will be different for everyone.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I know what I need to do to self-soothe, and I need time out away from everything, just space to sit and be and pray and not have to talk as well. I think one of the differences for us in funeral ministry, as Christians, that we so particularly my ministry is quite often you will know, you'll go through a process of knowing the person before they died, perhaps because they was ill or because they've had some connection to you in the past in your churches or spaces where you go. Then there's the funeral, and then there's the aftercare, and that's the difference between our work in funeral ministry than say celebrants, because I'm not sure whether they offer anything afterwards. So that it isn't just about the funeral, is it, itself? That's one aspect of it, but it's the full, holding that full care package, if you like. And how do we do that? There was just a little story I wanted to share with you, if we've got time. It's only little. Many years ago, I was only a little girl. I would have been about 12. I know one of you were mentioning that you were 12 in one of your experiences. But I'd met a new friend, and I'd not known him very long. And he'd gone away. He was going away with his dad on a holiday, and I couldn't wait for him to come back. We'd met at school, our new schools, and we were really friendly. And he died on the way to this holiday in a car crash. And I remember afterwards finding out that he'd died because he didn't turn up at school. We didn't have social media and telephones like we do today. And I remember trying to talk about how that made me feel. And absolutely nobody could understand why I was even upset, because I'd not known this person very long. So it was just totally brushed off by everybody that I tried to speak to. And I remember that bothered me for years and years and years. And I'm 55, and I still think about that. So I think it's about, I suppose what I was trying to, one of the things that's taught me is never to think that we could possibly know what people are thinking and feeling. Yes, I was a child then, but that's still something that's on my mind today. So we carry things for all of our lives, don't we? Things that negative or positive that we may have felt. And I suppose those kind of, it's remembering how I felt about that and how I feel about it today, that actually does help me in this ministry in some way now. So I just wanted to share. I'd written that down when one of you were talking, and it just reminded me. So I wrote that down and wanted to share that with you. But anyway, thank you. Bill, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, shall we have space for conversational questions? There may be questions arising from what Sarah shared, or from the models that Mark was presenting, or equally may not be a question, it may just be a response. It's something that sort of triggers in something in you that you want to share. So a bit of conversation would be good. Keith, you've got your hand up. Yeah, you have to unmute yourself. I think you're muted at the moment, Keith.
No. Interesting, Mark, you brought up about Princess Diana. At the time when she died, I was working for JNER, which had the franchise for the East Coast Main Line. And I used to do Leeds London twice a day as part of cabin crew. And we were in London on the Tuesday afterwards, and myself and one of the other stewardesses went across London with flowers, and were probably one of the earliest ones to get there. By the time the funeral came on the Saturday, they were running special trains from Leeds down into London. And as it wasn't my working day, they were asking for volunteers, and I went. And I ended up talking to a woman on the train who sat there very quietly in the carriage, and I asked her if she was okay. And she said to me, "I've never been to London before. I've never been on a train before." And she was probably in her 60s. But she said, "I don't know what else to do. I just want to come and pay my respects." So she said, "But I don't know where to go, what to do." So when we landed at King's Cross, I went down and picked her up, and I walked her round and down into the subways and that to get the tube and told her which way to go to where she was going, and off she went. Never saw her again. But the add-on to that is that when Queen Elizabeth died and the churches were open, it was amazing the number of people who walk through the door and say, "I haven't been in here for a long time, but I don't know where else to go or what to do. I just need to go somewhere and do something." And it's fascinating in itself how people think like that, but it's also an honor to be at the other end and to help them when it does happen.
Yes, when Sarah was sharing, I was thinking there's a sense that people look to us because it's viewed that we have words or some sort of maybe authority, almost is the right word, connected to death, and that there are things that, or at least we have an understanding of it, or words that can be put to sort of temper it, to control it in some way. And so yeah, people look for us, whether that's after someone has died, or as Sarah was saying, going in somewhere and helping provide people with a language to talk about what's happening. Yeah, I guess also I remember when I was training, someone talking about just being aware of someone sitting at the back of a funeral who sort of seems to be grieving more than you might expect given the relationship, and perhaps that ties into that aspect of sort of disambiguous grief. And so when national things happen, it allows people to express things that they maybe haven't been able to do previously, whether that was because they were children and it wasn't allowed, or somehow their grieving got caught up because, as I think you said, Keith, it was almost you got caught up with your doing the work after, was it your dad's funeral? And then it was only really when your other parent died that you could suddenly do that. So yeah, we sort of, our grief comes and goes at different times, and other things tap into that.
Can I flag up something, Mark? You mentioned one of your early slides about anticipatory grief, which I think is interesting. So when you sense the death is coming, and if someone's got a prolonged painful illness, you do a lot of grieving before the person dies, and then you might feel a bit bad about not feeling sad after the person dies in the way that you're expected to. Is that a fair comment? Is that an experience?
Yes, yeah, I think so. Or I think sometimes there's a sort of almost a sort of a brief or a short grief as well for people where particularly maybe if a partner's died and someone remarries in a relatively short time. It's not the aspect, I think, why that last model is helpful, because it's not that someone is necessarily not still grieving, but they are also sort of reorientating in that way. So yeah, the way that different feelings can be experienced.
And there's the exhaustion, isn't there? For those that are caring for somebody that's dying, and they see what that person's going through, the pain, you know, which you're experiencing. You might not be in the physical pain, but you're certainly in pain. So there is a sense of, I've spoken to people that said, I know I shouldn't feel like this, but I'm relieved. And I said, okay, you know, yeah, of course you are, because you couldn't bear to see them suffering anymore. And then on the other side of that, there's the then holding on to small pieces of, I mean, we've probably all heard the people say that a robin's been into the garden, so their granny's been, or feathers and all that. Then after a certain amount of time, then looking for signs of that person in other things, which I find quite beautiful. It doesn't, you know, I would never tell somebody that that's not right, because what do I know anyway, how what God does. But
and I guess both of your light experience and my rainbow experience, there are some examples of that in some ways, aren't they?
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's a self-soothing, I suppose, thing, isn't it, in all that.
Kate, you were wanting to ask something.
Yeah, there was just a couple of things that kind of came up to me. One was our pastoral team did some training with a company called Care for the Family. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with them particularly, but they came and did some grief training with us. And one of the model that they talked about that went, and I'd heard it before, but it really stuck with me. And some of the things, so one of the things I do volunteering, I work a lot with pregnant and parents of young children, and quite often you're working with people who might have had miscarriages or loss at some point, and sometimes they're then dealing with the grief of having lost a baby, and then they're having another baby and they're feeling very guilty about it. So I found that this is a model that seems to work quite well around that, which is the tennis ball model, which is basically that grief is like a tennis ball hitting a button, and it's in a box. And when somebody first dies, the box is tiny, and your entire life is just basically that one big button, and the grief ball is literally hitting that button constantly. And it's not that the ball or the button get any bigger, but as your life moves on from that experience of the initial period, the box gets bigger, and as your life expands around your grief. So when the ball hits the button, it doesn't necessarily hit any less hard. So those moments of profound grief that you can experience even years after somebody's died, those they're not don't necessarily feel any less painful. And I think that's something that I think we forget sometimes, that it like you said, it's that like going all over the place kind of experience, but it's not 2 years and you're cured kind of a thing. That grief can come up at the most unexpected moments. And I think linking into the stuff you were saying about with Princess Diana and with the Queen, some of that's the trigger that's making the ball hit the button. So I just wanted to share that. And also when you were talking about managing how you don't take on all the emotions and how you manage like yourself. So I'm a peer supporter for breastfeeding. And one of the things when they trained us on that was we always had a supervisor. Everybody has a supervisor somewhere along the way. And we always had a supervisor, and we were basically told that when we did a breastfeeding support session with somebody, we then went to that other person to offload whatever needed offloading from it. And I think it might not be, in this situation, it might not be your supervisor. So obviously I verger at a lot of funerals, and effectively the person that leads the funeral and myself, where we can, try to go out for a coffee afterwards to basically fill each other's cups back up and kind of offload to each other and share that so that it doesn't feel like it's all on you. And I think it might not be the same for everyone because, like Sarah says, Sarah likes to go and be completely on her own. So sitting in a coffee shop's probably the last thing she wants. But it's that having somebody that when you have that more difficult case that you can go to and have that discussion with. And I think that's going to be an important part of what you find during the course of this course as well. That makes sense.
Yeah, I've heard that same sort of model described, but as sort of concentric circles and life expanding. But yeah, I think it's a very helpful notion, isn't it, that when grief gets touched, it can be as raw as it was right at the beginning. It just maybe doesn't happen quite so much. Certainly with bereaved parents, and again, quite a lot of the continuing bonds stuff came out of people listening to the experience of bereaved parents. There's a thing called shadow grief that gets talked about, and this notion of the sort of a grieving for the future that would have been had, as opposed to, so sort of in a sense, when an adult dies, when our parents die, we're looking back. But when a baby, particularly, or a young person's died, it's the sense of looking forward. And people talk about waking up on the third Thursday of August and suddenly realizing the person would have been 18, in A-level results day or whatever it is. So yeah, that continuing to carry it and coming back, and the bottom being pushed. So yeah, thank you. I guess obviously you'll have people in your own churches that you can talk with, but it may be actually all of you as cohorts might be able to self-support each other as well in some ways. That might be something that comes out of this, of when you've had difficult funerals, or if you've got something coming up when you sort of think, oh my goodness, how am I going to manage this, that you could just sort of message someone else who's been part of this journey through the course with you. So that might be one thing for us to think about.
Yeah, because you would have that if you'd been to theological college, you would have that if you'd been trained as you'd have that group of people as readers. So I think it's important to have something like that in place as well. Yeah.
We have Jonathan and I both did, and Simon did the foundations course last year, and we have a WhatsApp group now with everybody on it. And if there's ever anything or anyone who wants prayers, it's just there, and it's a great help to have and back up. Definitely.
Sure.
Definitely.
Thank you. Yeah. I'm just aware time's just about up, so we probably better draw things to a close. So thank you to everybody, especially for all that's been shared tonight. We've shared some quite powerful and personal stuff, and you may need to think, how do you go and process for the next half an hour? What's your best way to move on from this, whether it's a bit of silence or a bit of music or a bit of exercise, or in my case, being harassed by the cat who's just turned up on my shoulder. But anyway, do think about what you need before you go to bed. And we'll meet again 13th of January, Tuesday, 13th of January is another of these online sessions. So if you just make sure 13th of January is in your diary. And just encourage you to keep in touch with your incumbent, whoever was supervising you, and just continue creating those opportunities to be involved with funerals and to reflect with them that whole part of the course, as well as starting to jot down your own thoughts in some kind of reflective journal about all this. That would be good too. I'll just close in a minute with verse from Psalm 23 again. Anything else, Sarah and Mark, before we wind up? Anything else you want to throw in? No, thanks especially to you two for all that you've guided us through. And as Mark mentioned, we'll send you the slides. Once this video is processed, I'll send you the slides and the video link at the same time, because a couple of people missing, but also you may well want to revise some of what we've looked at this evening. There's a lot of quite profound stuff in all kinds of dimensions. So thank you very much for all of that. let's take a moment just to reflect, especially if there's one thing from the evening that stands out that we really want to hold on to and take forward. Let's give thanks for the people we've thought of tonight as we've talked our memories, and people who've been significant in our lives, especially those who we've lost, and also those among whom we've ministered in their losses. We pray God's grace for them and for ourselves. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Let's just take that familiar promise to heart afresh. The middle of that psalm, the you are with me, that phrase that rings all the way through the Old and New Testaments. God with us. We take hold of that afresh for ourselves for this night. And you might like to pray for those around you. If you look at the screen, see whoever it is at Zoom in its infinite wisdom has placed alongside your picture. You might pray especially for those people on the screen. Let's pray for each other in the words of the grace. If we can all unmute, we'll do the sort of the chaotic Zoom grace where we have the time lag, because I still quite like that, even though it's rather messy. But yeah, let's pray for each other in the words of the grace. May the grace
of our Lord Jesus Christ,
and the
love
of
of
God,
God,
the
and
fellowship
fellowship
the
of the Holy Spirit
Spirit
be with us all
evermore.
Amen. Gosh, that's not good for my ADHD.
You can go and lie down in a dark room now, Sarah.
I know, I'm going to have to.
Thank you all.